Right now, you could name at least 3 things you're better at than the average person. Your driving, your sense of humor, your ability to spot a liar. Here's the strange part. Statistically, most people can't all be above average. Someone has to be below the line. And yet almost nobody thinks it's them. This isn't arrogance. It isn't ego, not in the way you'd expect. It's something quieter, something built into the architecture of your mind, and it's running in the background of nearly every decision you make today. You trust your judgment. You trust your memory. You trust your gut. But what if the thing doing the trusting is the least reliable part of the system? Think about the last time you were completely sure about something. Maybe it was a fact you shared at dinner. Maybe it was a prediction about how a meeting would go. Maybe it was just knowing, deep down, that you'd remember to send that email. How sure were you? 90%? 95%? Now ask yourself honestly, how often are you actually wrong? If you're like most people, the answer is more often than you'd guess. Not because you're careless, because your brain isn't built to measure its own accuracy. It's built to feel confident, and confidence and correctness are not the same thing. They just feel identical from the inside. Picture a woman named Claire, sitting down to take a work certification exam she studied for over 3 weekends. Before the test even begins, she tells a coworker she's expecting a 90, maybe higher. She feels ready. The material felt familiar as she reviewed it. The practice questions felt easy. Confidence radiates off her. She finishes the exam feeling good, even walks out early. 2 days later, the results come back. 72%. Passing, but nowhere close to what she predicted. She's confused. She studied. She felt like she understood everything. So what went wrong? Nothing went wrong with her effort. What went wrong was her ability to judge her own understanding. Recognizing a fact while reading it feels the same, in the moment, as being able to recall and apply that fact under pressure. Claire's brain mistook familiarity for mastery. That gap between how good you think you are and how good you actually are has a name. It's called the overconfidence effect. And it's one of the most well-documented, most stubborn biases in human psychology. It doesn't just affect test takers. It affects doctors diagnosing patients, drivers merging onto highways, investors picking stocks, and executives launching products they're certain will succeed. Nearly everyone. Nearly all the time. So why does this happen? Why is your brain so bad at knowing what it doesn't know? Part of the answer traces back to psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, whose decades of research on judgment under uncertainty reshaped how scientists understand human decision-making. Kahneman described the mind as running on 2 systems. System 1 is fast, intuitive, automatic. System 2 is slow, effortful, analytical. Most of your daily judgments run on System 1. It's efficient. It's also frequently, confidently, wrong. System 1 doesn't pause to ask, how do I actually know this? It just generates a feeling of certainty and hands it to you as fact. There's also the research of psychologists Justin Kruger and David Dunning, whose famous studies found that people with the least skill in a given area often rate their ability the highest. Not because they're delusional, but because the same lack of skill that makes someone bad at a task also makes them unable to recognize how bad they are. You need a certain level of competence just to accurately judge competence. It's a blind spot that hides itself. And then there's what researcher Sarah Lichtenstein, along with Baruch Fishoff, uncovered through decades of calibration studies. They asked people to answer trivia questions and then rate how confident they were in each answer. Again and again, when people said they were 100% sure, they were right only about 80% of the time. The overconfidence wasn't occasional. It was systematic, built in. present across almost every group tested. Here's the mechanism underneath all of this. Your brain craves coherence. It wants a clean, simple story about the world and about yourself, more than it wants an accurate one. When you form a belief, whether it's about your driving skill or your knowledge of history or your read on a coworker's intentions, your mind doesn't run a background check. It doesn't cross-reference evidence. It just checks whether the belief feels stable and familiar. If it does, you accept it. Certainty, to your brain, is a feeling, not a measurement. There's a term for another piece of this puzzle. It's called illusory superiority, the tendency to overestimate your own positive qualities and abilities relative to others. It shows up almost everywhere researchers look. In one famous finding, the vast majority of drivers surveyed rated themselves as above average behind the wheel. Mathematically impossible. Psychologically inevitable. Why would evolution build a mind this confident, this often wrong? Because confidence, even unearned confidence, was historically useful for action. A hesitant hunter who second-guessed every decision often ate less than a confident one who moved decisively, even when that decisiveness wasn't always justified by actual skill. Certainty helped your ancestors act fast in a dangerous world. Being exactly right was often less important than being fast and committed. That wiring didn't disappear just because modern life now punishes overconfidence in new ways, like bad investments, misdiagnoses, or overconfident predictions that blow up in boardrooms. So if this bias is universal, is it actually a problem or just a quirk? It's worth noticing where overconfidence quietly does the most damage. Not in trivia games. In money, health, and decisions with real weight behind them. Picture a man named Devin, an amateur investor who's read a handful of articles and watched some videos on trading. He starts believing he has a feel for the market, a kind of intuition other people lack. He puts a significant portion of his savings into a single stock he's certain is about to take off. He isn't reckless by nature. He's careful in most areas of his life. But in this one decision, his confidence outran his actual knowledge, and he didn't feel the gap because, from the inside, confidence and competence feel exactly the same. 6 months later, the stock drops sharply. Devin isn't unusual. Research on retail investors consistently shows that the most confident traders tend to trade more frequently and earn lower returns than more cautious ones. Confidence didn't predict success. It predicted risk. Overconfidence made the danger invisible until it was already too late to avoid it. Here's where it gets stranger, though. You might assume that becoming more knowledgeable about something would simply erase this bias, but the relationship isn't that clean. Sometimes learning a little bit about a topic makes people feel more confident than learning nothing at all, and dramatically more confident than the mastery that comes much later. Real expertise often brings back some humility, because deep knowledge reveals just how much complexity exists beneath the surface. It's the person with a moderate amount of knowledge, not the true expert and not the true beginner, who is often the most overconfident of all. Enough information to feel certain. Not enough experience yet to know what they're missing. That's the trap. A little bit of learning can feel like the finish line, when really, it's just the starting stretch. And overconfidence doesn't only distort what you believe about facts. It distorts how you plan your future. There's a well-documented pattern called the planning fallacy. First described in detail by Kahneman and Tversky, where people consistently underestimate how long tasks will take, even when they've been wrong about timing before, over and over again. You've probably done this yourself. Told yourself a project would take a weekend, then watched it stretch into 2 weeks. Each time, the same overconfident prediction resurfaces, undisturbed by the last failure to predict it accurately. So what can you actually do with this information? Awareness alone doesn't fix a bias this deeply wired in, but there are ways to work around it. One method researchers point to is something like a primortem, a technique where before making a decision, you imagine that it has already failed, and then work backward to figure out why. This forces your mind out of confident storytelling mode and into a more analytical one, closer to Kahneman's slower System 2 thinking. It interrupts the automatic certainty long enough for you to actually examine it. Another simple habit is to ask yourself not am I right, but how would I know if I were wrong? That single reframe forces your brain to search for disconfirming evidence instead of just basking in the comfortable glow of a belief that already feels true. You can also build in outside checks, deliberately seeking a second opinion, a fact check, a gut check from someone who doesn't share your assumptions. It feels unnecessary in the moment. It rarely is. So think back to Claire walking out of that exam early, so sure she'd nailed it. Think about Devon watching his investment slide while wondering how he'd been so certain. Neither of them was foolish. They were human, running on a mind that mistakes the feeling of knowing for actually knowing. Right now, somewhere in your life, there's a belief you're holding with total confidence. Maybe about your abilities. Maybe about a decision you've already made. Maybe about something you're certain will go exactly the way you expect. It feels solid. It feels obvious. That feeling is not proof. The next time certainty shows up fast and effortless, pause for just a second and ask yourself the question your brain would rather skip. How do I actually know this? If this changed the way you think about your own certainty, consider sticking around. There's a lot more hiding in the way your mind works than it ever lets on.